Eleanor Grayson sat alone in the dim glow of her kitchen, the clock ticking past midnight. The house, once filled with the warmth of her husband Arthur's laughter, now felt like a hollow shell. It had been 3 months since Arthur's heart gave out. 3 months since the world she'd known for 50 years crumbled. At 70, Eleanor's hands trembled as she traced the edges of a photograph Arthur, smiling, his arm around her in their garden, the roses he'd tended blooming behind them. That garden was gone now, just like him, swallowed by neglect and her grief. She hadn't expected the betrayal to come so soon. Arthur's family, his sister Margaret, his nephew Daniel, and the cousins who'd never bothered to visit had descended like vultures the day after the funeral. They'd sat in her living room, sipping her tea, their eyes cold as they spoke of practicalities. The house, they said, was in Arthur's name. The savings, the investments, the life they'd built together, it was all his. Legally, Eleanor, they claimed, was just a guest in their family's legacy. Margaret's voice had been sharp, her words slicing through Eleanor's fog of mourning. You're not blood. Eleanor, it's time to move on. Move on. As if 50 years of marriage, of shared dreams and quiet mornings, could be erased with a single phrase. They gave her a week to pack, a week to leave the home where she and Arthur had raised their daughter, Sarah, who now lived across the country, too busy to intervene. Eleanor had pleaded, her voice breaking, but Daniel's smirk told her everything. They'd planned this. The will, they said, was clear. Arthur's assets would go to his true family. Eleanor, the woman who'd nursed him through illness, who'd laughed with him under starlit skies, was nothing to them. She'd left with 2 suitcases and a heart heavy with betrayal. The small apartment she rented in town smelled of mildew, its walls thin enough to hear her neighbors' arguments. Eleanor spent her days staring at the photograph, her nights haunted by memories of Arthur's voice. But something shifted in her on that cold November evening. As rain battered the window, she wasn't just grieving anymore. She was angry. Arthur had always been meticulous, a man who planned for every possibility. He'd told her, years ago, about the accounts, the ones they'd set up together, the ones she'd forgotten in the haze of routine. If anything happens to me, he'd said, you'll be taken care of. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the photograph. She remembered the bank, the safe deposit box, the documents Arthur had insisted she sign. They hadn't checked everything, had they? Margaret and Daniel thought they'd won, but they didn't know Arthur like she did. The next morning, Eleanor dressed carefully, her best coat hiding the frayed edges of her blouse. She walked to the bank, her steps steady despite the ache in her knees. The building loomed ahead, its marble columns gleaming under the gray sky. Inside, the air was cool, the tellers' voices hushed. Eleanor approached the counter, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. I'd like to access my safe deposit box, she said, sliding her ID across the counter. The clerk, a young man with kind eyes, nodded and led her to the vault. The box was heavy, its contents a mystery she hadn't touched in years. When she opened it, her breath caught. Stacks of papers, neatly labeled, stared back at her. Deeds, bonds, account statements, Arthur's handwriting on every one, meticulous and deliberate. There was a letter, too, addressed to her in his familiar scrawl. Her hands shook as she unfolded it, the words blurring through her tears. My dearest Ellie, if you're reading this, I'm gone. But you're stronger than you know. Everything we built is yours, too. Don't let them take it. Fight for it. I love you always. Eleanor clutched the letter to her chest, her resolve hardening. They thought they could erase her, but they were wrong. She'd take it all back, every cent, every memory, every piece of the life she and Arthur had made. The bank was just the beginning. Eleanor sat at the small table in her apartment. The contents of the safe deposit box spread before her like a map to a forgotten world. The documents were a testament to Arthur's foresight, bank accounts in both their names, investments she'd never fully understood, and a second deed to the house, one that listed her as co-owner. Her heart pounded as she read through the papers, each one a lifeline Arthur had left her. How had she forgotten these details? Grief, she supposed, had a way of clouding the mind. But now the fog was lifting. She spent hours sorting through the papers, her fingers tracing Arthur's handwriting. There was a savings account with enough to cover years of expenses, a brokerage account with stocks that had grown steadily, and a life insurance policy naming her as the sole beneficiary. Margaret and Daniel hadn't mentioned these. Had they known? Or had they assumed Arthur's wealth was tied only to the house and the accounts they'd seized? Eleanor's jaw tightened. They'd underestimated her, and they'd underestimated Arthur. The letter weighed heaviest on her mind. Arthur's words were a call to action, a reminder of the woman she'd been before grief dulled her edges. She'd always been the practical one, the one who balanced their checkbook while Arthur dreamed of new rose varieties. Now, she'd use that practicality to fight back. But first, she needed to understand the full scope of what she was up against. Eleanor called Sarah that evening, her daughter's voice a faint comfort over the phone. "Mom, why didn't you tell me they kicked you out?" Sarah's tone was sharp with guilt. Eleanor sighed, explaining the eviction, the cruelty of Margaret's words, and the discovery in the bank. Sarah was furious, promising to fly in from Seattle. But Eleanor stopped her. "I need to do this myself," she said. "Your father left me what I need. I just have to use it." The next day, Eleanor returned to the bank, this time to meet with a financial advisor. Mr. Thompson, a gray-haired man with a gentle demeanor, listened as she explained her situation. His eyes widened as she laid out the documents, his fingers skimming the pages. "Mrs. Grayson," he said, "these accounts are substantial, and the deed it's ironclad. The house is legally yours, too. They can't take it without a fight." A fight. The word sparked something in Eleanor, a flicker of the fire she'd thought died with Arthur. She asked Mr. Thompson to transfer the funds to a new account, one only she could access. She watched as he typed, the numbers on the screen a quiet vindication. By the time she left, she had control of the savings and investments, a total that made her head spin. Arthur had planned for her, just as he'd promised. But the house was another matter. Margaret and Daniel had already moved in, their furniture replacing the life she'd built. Eleanor drove by one evening, her heart twisting at the sight of Daniel's car in the driveway, Margaret's curtains in the windows. She didn't stop, didn't let them see her. Instead, she returned to her apartment and called a lawyer, a woman named Clara who'd been recommended by Mr. Thompson. Clara's voice was brisk but kind, her questions sharp. "We'll start with the deed," she said. "They can't ignore it. And if they try, we'll hit them where it hurts." Eleanor felt a surge of hope, tempered by fear. This wasn't just about money or a house, it was about reclaiming her dignity, her place in Arthur's life. She wouldn't let them erase her. Not now. Not ever. Clara's office was a small, cluttered space filled with books and files, but it felt like a fortress to Eleanor. The lawyer's confidence was infectious. Her plan clear. They'd file a claim to enforce the deed, demand access to the house, and challenge the family's interpretation of Arthur's will. "They're banking on you giving up," Clara said, her eyes narrowing. "But we're going to make them regret this." Eleanor nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wasn't used to fighting. Not like this. Arthur had been the one to handle disputes, his calm voice smoothing over any conflict. But now, it was her turn. Clara prepared the paperwork, and within days, a formal letter was sent to Margaret and Daniel, demanding they vacate the house and acknowledge Eleanor's rights as co-owner. The response came quickly. A curt note from Daniel's lawyer dismissing her claim as baseless. They were digging in. The first court date was set for a month later, giving Eleanor time to prepare. She spent her days with Clara, reviewing documents and recounting every detail of her marriage to Arthur. She spoke of their life together, their first home, a tiny apartment where they danced to the radio, the birth of Sarah, Arthur's proud tears, the garden they tended, a symbol of their shared dreams. Clara listened, her pen moving swiftly, turning Eleanor's memories into evidence. At night, Eleanor returned to her apartment, the silence oppressive. She'd started writing letters to Arthur, not to send but to feel him near. "I'm fighting. Arthur," she wrote. "I'm doing this for us." The words kept her grounded, a reminder of why she couldn't give up. She also began reaching out to old friends, people who'd known her and Arthur as a couple. Many were shocked to hear of the family's betrayal, offering support and even affidavits to confirm Arthur's intentions. Their kindness was a balm, but it couldn't erase the sting of Margaret's cruelty. One afternoon, Eleanor received a call from Daniel. His voice was smooth, almost conciliatory. "Aunt Eleanor, let's settle this quietly," he said. "We'll give you a small payout, and you can move on. No need for courts." Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened. She saw through his off-air bribe to make her disappear. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice steady. "I want what's mine." She hung up, her heart racing with a mix of fear and triumph. The community began to talk. Word of Eleanor's fight spread, and neighbors who'd once greeted Margaret politely now turned away. A local reporter caught wind of the story, publishing a piece about Eleanor's struggling, a widow fighting for her home against a greedy family. The article painted Eleanor as a symbol of resilience, and letters of support poured in. Strangers sent her cards, some with small donations, others with words of encouragement. Eleanor read each one, tears in her eyes, feeling less alone. As the court date approached, Eleanor felt the weight of what was coming. This wasn't just about winning, it was about proving she mattered, that her life with Arthur couldn't be erased. She stood in her tiny bathroom, staring at her reflection. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, her eyes clear despite the lines of age and grief. She was ready. The courtroom was smaller than Eleanor had imagined, its wooden benches worn but polished. She sat beside Clara, her hands clasped to hide their trembling. Across the room, Margaret and Daniel sat with their lawyer, a man in an expensive suit who whispered to them constantly. Margaret's eyes met Eleanor's once, cold and unyielding. Before looking away, Daniel avoided her gaze entirely, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. Clara presented their case with precision, laying out the deed, the bank accounts, and Arthur's letter. She called witnesses, friends who testified to Arthur's devotion to Eleanor, a banker who confirmed the joint accounts, and even Sarah, who'd flown in to speak on her mother's behalf. Sarah's voice broke as she described her parents' love, their partnership, and her father's insistence that Eleanor be cared for. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, listened intently, her face unreadable. Margaret's lawyer countered with technicalities, arguing that the will superseded the deed and that Eleanor had no claim to the house. He painted her as a dependent, a woman who'd lived off Arthur's wealth without contributing. Eleanor's cheeks burned at the lie, but Clara squeezed her hand, whispering, "Let them dig their own grave." The lawyer's arrogance was his weakness, Clara said, and the judge seemed to notice, her brow furrowing at his dismissive tone. Outside the courtroom, Eleanor faced Margaret for the first time since the eviction. Margaret approached. Her lips pursed. "You're embarrassing yourself, Eleanor," she said. "Arthur would be ashamed." The words cut deep, but Eleanor stood taller, her voice steady. "Arthur loved me," she said. "He'd be ashamed of you." Margaret flinched, and for a moment, Eleanor saw doubt in her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that familiar coldness. The hearing stretched over days, each one draining Eleanor a little more. She returned to her apartment each night, exhausted but resolute. Sarah stayed with her, cooking meals and sharing stories of Arthur to keep her spirits up. One evening, Sarah found an old photo album, and they sat together, laughing and crying over memories. It reminded Eleanor of what she was fighting for, not just a house, but the life it represented. A breakthrough came when Clara uncovered a discrepancy in Margaret's financial records. She'd been withdrawing money from one of Arthur's accounts before his death, claiming it was for family expenses. Clara presented the evidence in court, and the judge's expression darkened. Margaret stammered under questioning, her composure cracking. Daniel, too, seemed rattled, his earlier confidence gone. Eleanor watched, her heart pounding. They were unraveling. The judge adjourned the case for a week to review the evidence. Eleanor left the courtroom feeling lighter, as if a weight had shifted. She didn't know if she'd win, but she knew she'd fought. For Arthur, for herself, for the love they'd built. That night, she wrote another letter to Arthur, her words fierce and proud. "I'm not done yet," she wrote. "They'll see who I am." The final day in court was a blur of nerves and anticipation. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress, one Arthur had always loved, its color a quiet nod to him. The courtroom was packed: neighbors, friends, even strangers who'd read the newspaper article. Their presence bolstered her, a reminder that she wasn't alone. Clara stood beside her, her briefcase stuffed with notes and evidence, her confidence unwavering. The judge began with a summary, her voice steady and authoritative. She acknowledged the complexity of the case, the conflicting claims, and the emotional weight of Arthur's death. Eleanor's heart sank as the judge noted the will. But then she turned to the deed, the accounts, and Arthur's letter. "It is clear," the judge said, "that Arthur Grayson intended for his wife, Eleanor, to be provided for. The evidence supports her claim to the house and the joint assets." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Daniel's face paled, his lawyer whispering frantically. The judge continued, ruling that the house was legally Eleanor's, as was the money in the joint accounts. She also ordered an investigation into Margaret's unauthorized withdrawals, a decision that sent a murmur through the courtroom. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she held her head high, feeling Arthur's presence in the victory. The aftermath was chaotic. Margaret stormed out, Daniel trailing behind her, their lawyer scrambling to keep up. Clara hugged Eleanor, her smile triumphant. Sarah was there, too, her arms around her mother, whispering, "You did it, Mom." Eleanor nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. She'd won back her home, her security, her dignity. That evening, Eleanor returned to the house for the first time in months. Margaret and Daniel had already begun moving out, their belongings hastily packed. The garden was overgrown, the roses wilted, but Eleanor saw potential, not ruin. She walked through the rooms, touching the walls, the furniture, the places where Arthur's laughter still lingered. She felt him there, in every corner, and knew she'd made him proud. The community rallied around her. Neighbors brought casseroles, offered to help with the garden, and shared stories of Arthur's kindness. Eleanor began to rebuild, slowly, planting new roses and repainting the walls. She invited Sarah to visit often, and they spent evenings together, planning a future that honored Arthur's memory. But Eleanor wasn't done fighting. She decided to use part of the money to start a small foundation in Arthur's name, helping other widows facing similar betrayals. It was her way of turning pain into purpose, of ensuring no one else would feel as alone as she had. Eleanor stood in her garden, the morning sun warm on her face. The roses were blooming again, their petals vibrant against the green. It had been 6 months since the court's decision. 6 months since she'd reclaimed her home and her life. The house was hers again, filled with new memories alongside the old. Sarah visited often, her laughter echoing through the rooms, a sound that healed Eleanor's heart a little more each day. The foundation was taking shape, too. Eleanor had named it Arthur's Legacy, a small but growing organization that provided legal aid and financial support to widows. She'd hired Clara to oversee its legal aspects, and the community had rallied behind it, donating time and money. Eleanor spoke at local events, sharing her story, her voice steady as she encouraged others to fight for their rights. She'd become a beacon, a woman who'd turned betrayal into strength. Margaret and Daniel had faded from her life. The investigation into Margaret's withdrawals led to a settlement, forcing her to repay what she'd taken. They'd moved away, their influence diminished, their greed exposed. Eleanor didn't wish them ill. She learned to let go of the anger, focusing instead on the life she was rebuilding. One evening, as she sat in the garden with a cup of tea, Eleanor felt a peace she hadn't known since Arthur's death. She still missed him, a quiet ache that would never fully fade. But she no longer felt broken. She'd fought for their love, their home, their legacy, and she'd won. The photograph of Arthur sat on the table beside her, his smile a reminder of their shared strength. She wrote one final letter to him, her words soft and grateful. "We did it, Arthur," she wrote. "I'm home, and I'm whole. Thank you for believing in me." She folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer, knowing she didn't need to write anymore. Arthur was with her, in the roses, in the house, in the life she'd reclaimed. Eleanor looked out at the garden, the horizon glowing with the promise of a new day. She was 70, but she felt alive, purposeful, ready for whatever came next. She'd taken everything back, not just the money or the house, but her courage, her voice, her place in the world. And that, she knew, was the greatest victory of all.